So it is 11 o'clock here and we already have quite a few participants. So I think we should just get started today. Thank you for joining our webinar Inside Out, the state of the evidence on household air pollution's contribution to ambient air pollution. Before we get started, I just want to give a few logistics for all of the participants. Everybody is muted, and if you have a question, put it into the question and answer feature, and then, or if you have any technical difficulties, and we will provide support through that mechanism today. So I will be giving our welcoming note along with John Mitchell from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And then the bulk of our time together will be with Sourangsu Chowdhury from Cicero and Ajay Pillarisetti from UC Berkeley, both of which will be talking about basically the contribution of household air pollution to ambient air pollution. And then at the end, we will have 15 minutes for questions and answers. Before we get started, I'm Donnie Alexander. I lead our research and evaluation here at the Clean Cooking Alliance. And so really happy to have this group of researchers with us today to talk about this important topic. Before we get into it, though, for those of you who are new to learning about the Clean Cooking Alliance, wanted just to give a brief overview of the Clean Cooking Alliance. So we work with a global network of partners to build an inclusive industry that makes clean cooking accessible to families around the world. And we really have three core pillars. The first is driving consumer demand. So we really want to ensure that the devices that are the clean cooking appliances and devices that are in the market are demand driven, that there is demand for those appliances. We also work on mobilizing investment to build the supply, to build the pipeline of scalable businesses. And then also focus on working on the fostering and enabling environment. So really working with governments and others to ensure that we are supporting the enabling environment as well. So really what we're talking about today is not something that is new. We've known for a long time that household air pollution also contributes to ambient air pollution. And that's really what this is about. But we wanted to get a little bit deeper into it. Where are the missing links? What do we not know? Where do we see more contribution of household air pollution to ambient air pollution, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think we'll get into this later on, but basically we do know that it is a major source of ambient air pollution globally, household air pollution is. We know that at the global level, residential burning of biomass is responsible for around 20%, and there are different numbers out there of the total ambient particulate matter, PM 2.5. And so with this, I mean, because it is such a big contributor to ambient air pollution, we really want to get to the point that it needs to be addressed along with other sources to improve air quality and public health globally. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to John Mitchell from EPA. Oh, there's one more slide, but go ahead to John.
Thank you so much, Donnie. I'm John Mitchell from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where I coordinate our household energy and clean air activities. I also work closely with colleagues from throughout the U.S. government in an interagency working group on cook stoves and household energy. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this dissemination of the state of the evidence on household air pollution's contribution to ambient air pollution. From the first time I learned and understood the significant contribution of emissions from home cooking and heating that they have on ambient air pollution in China, I've been eager to learn and know more about what the situation is in other parts of the world. It's interesting. We usually work on the sort of the global level or the local level on household energy. We focus on the significant, really shocking global impacts from cooking and heating with biomass and coal. Anyone who's been involved in this issue knows that around 4 million premature deaths annually, about 2% of global CO2 emissions, the largest controllable source of black carbon, environmental impacts like land degradation and habitat loss, gender inequity, and livelihood issues of about 40% of the world's population. Or we focus really narrowly on homes. What is the efficiency and emissions of the baseline stove and technology? How does an improved technology work in the laboratory or in the field? What are clean fuels and how do they work? How frequently is each stove in a home used? And what are exposure to the cook and to her children? What are health impacts? These are all very important questions and issues. But these issues are often localized to a home or a community, and issues that are often considered by policymakers to be rural issues remote from their experience and that of urban residents of a country. A priority, sure, but not usually a top priority of many governments. But characterizing the contribution to ambient air pollution changes the focus from a local exposure issue to a regional air quality issue, and shows how emissions from what may seem a world away, rural parts of a country, impact urban centers, country capitals, really everyone in a country. And as such, this information has the chance to elevate action on finding and then moving forward to implement household energy solutions. So as you can tell, I'm pretty fired up about this issue and the presentations today and their implications. So I'd like to turn this over to Ajay and Sourangsu. Ajay?
Thanks. We stole our title from a Pixar classic. Unfortunately, we won't be screening that today, but you might feel some of these emotions throughout the conversation. Next slide, please. So what are we really here to talk about? We're going to tell you a little bit about the state of evidence for household air pollution's contribution to ambient air pollution. This is a photograph from North India in Ladakh early in the morning. And we think it illustrates kind of the overall issue pretty well, right? So everyone fires up their heating and cooking stoves in the morning. Not surprisingly, it's a cold place. And of course, they have so-called improved stoves. These are metal stoves with a couple potholes that are enclosed and a chimney. And you can see, of course, all the pollution escaping outwards, impacting not only the neighbors, but everyone else in the community and the broader ecosystem. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a little stage setting and then hand it over to Sourangsu to talk about a lot of the work he's done in recent years, trying to wrap his head around and explain the contribution of household to ambient. When we think about these air pollutants, you know, we're likely all familiar with these major classes of air pollutants: PM, particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, tropospheric ozone. And we think about them coming from a source and leading to some health effects. And of course, this linear pathway that you've all probably seen before or thought about in some form or another isn't exactly right, because there are a number of different sources that ultimately contribute to exposure that leads to health effects. And so, of course, today we're just talking about that household contribution, but we're going to try to contextualize it around the emissions from other sources as well. And we're going to focus primarily on, next slide, particulate matter. And we'll talk about both anthropogenic and natural sources. Next slide, please. So ambient air pollution, greater than 98% of the global population is exposed to PM 2.5 levels, greater than the WHO air quality guideline of 5 micrograms per cubic meter. That's the new guideline that is very ambitious and very aspirational from a health protection standpoint, hard to attain in many places around the world. And the plot here shows you annual average PM 2.5 concentrations as modeled and estimated for numerous places around the world. This is associated with approximately 4 million deaths per year. You're going to hear us throw around some fairly large numbers like this, greater than 98%, that's 4 million deaths per year. And of course, there are ranges in those numbers and there's a lot of uncertainty, but the takeaway here is that it's a substantial burden and a substantial exposure everywhere. So just keep that in mind as we talk about these different numbers. And you may have in fact heard different ones. So between 3 and 4 billion people globally cook with solid fuels. Here we're talking about wood, grasses and dung, charcoal and coal. And that estimate varies, of course, but it's about half of the world's population. That household air pollution from the use of those fuels is a leading risk factor for ill health and mortality, and it results in approximately 3 to 4 million deaths per year on top of that ambient air pollution burden. And importantly, that household air pollution burden, at least from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, Global Burden of Disease, no longer includes the amount of burden that's resulting from households' contribution to ambient air pollution, and Sourangsu will dig into that a little bit more. If we look across the world, not surprisingly, the proportion of the population using solid fuels is mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and South and East Asia, and that's where the majority of the burden is as well. Next slide, please. And finally, if we just look over the last decade or so, the change in the proportion of the population using solid fuels, there has been a decrease globally, and in some places that decrease is more pronounced than others. I'll just draw attention to the brown line at the top, which is sub-Saharan Africa. You can see it's been fairly consistent. And for Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania, you've seen a decrease. So just to highlight a bit of the disparities globally in the use of solid fuels and the change over time, I'll now hand it over to Sourangsu.
Thanks, Ajay. And like Ajay said, exposure to household air pollution, or HAP, directly within the households are responsible for about 2.3 million deaths per year. And this makes HAP the 8th leading global risk factor contributing to disease burden. But a bigger risk factor in most low and middle income countries are LMICs. But what would surprise many is that HAP emitted indoors goes outdoors and is a leading contributor to outdoor ambient air pollution in regions where solid fuel use is dominant. As you know, PM2.5 pollution varies largely across geographies in spatial distribution, composition, and sources. In general, local sources such as transportation dominate in urban areas, while in background and rural areas, imported pollution or pollution transported from source regions dominate. However, HAP is often a larger source than other major sources of outdoor ambient air pollution in urban areas of LMICs, where use of solid fuel is prevalent. For example, studies have found that about 20% of air pollution in Delhi, metro housing about 25 million people, comes from solid fuel users in the vicinity of the city. And thus, HAP is not just a rural problem. So these figures that I put up here shows the rural to urban differences in PM2.5 in and around leading urban centers across the globe. A brownish tinge indicates higher urban concentration compared to rural. And though there are many factors contributing to this gradient, please note specifically the low gradient in rural to urban PM2.5 in sub-Saharan Africa and India, where solid fuel use in households are very prominent. And therefore, in regions where solid fuel use is very prevalent, you might not escape pollution even if you escape from cities for a nice and clean weekend. Next slide, please. So as you already might have sensed, it is very important to understand the sources of air pollution, as they are essential for appropriate designing of air quality policies. And the technique is called source apportionment. Source apportionment refers to the practice of obtaining information about the source sectors that contribute towards the pollutants of interest. Source apportionment techniques help to explicitly identify region-specific sources of pollution that may also help in designing region-specific action plans and assessing effectiveness of abatement measures. This is a very informative cartoon on source apportionment by urbanemissions.info. Next slide, please. And can be accessed through the following link. However, considering the complexity associated with source apportionment methodologies, a level of uncertainty will persist. But its advantages towards formulating effective air quality management programs are unmatched. There are currently two fundamental approaches to determine and quantify the impacts of air pollution sources. First, a top-down or receptor-based source apportionment, and the second are bottom-up or source-based methods. In a top-down approach, the ambient samples are collected in locations of interest, analyzed for their chemical composition, and then related to specific emission sources using receptor models. Emission sources have distinct chemical fingerprints, enabling this approach. Good thing about top-down approach is that it is observational and is computationally cheap. However, the only con is that it can tell about sources of a pollutant at only a specific location. Next slide, please. Yeah, so bottom-up modeling approaches, they utilize sector-specific information of emissions from emission inventories fed into complex Earth system models or regional chemical transport models that predict pollutant concentrations for a given space and time using a variety of input data sets. These models use multiple numerical equations and employ different methods of incorporating physical and chemical parameters such as precipitation microphysics, long wave and short wave radiation, aerosol chemistry, etc. These complex bottom-up models can be characterized as global models or regional models by their processing extents. And discussion on this talk will mostly focus on bottom-up models. Next slide, please. Yep. So just to give you an example on how the outputs from a bottom-up study are disseminated. For example, this study attributes ambient PM2.5 to 10 source sectors, of which 9 are anthropogenic and 1 natural. So the first 9 are anthropogenic and the last 1 is natural. And this study finds household air pollution in orange, in the orange bar, to be the leading anthropogenic sector worldwide, accounting for about 20% of total PM2.5 exposure, which is significantly higher than contributions from biomass burning, industry, energy, transportation, and agriculture. Next slide, please. And unlike top-down studies, bottom-up studies can infer about source contributions in any corner of the world and capture the large spatial heterogeneities. But what is interesting is that many bottom-up studies exist on HAP's contribution to ambient air pollution, and each has led to different estimates of this contribution. Bringing them together in the same page was the idea of this review. Next slide, please. But what made our task easy was that all of the studies till date indicate that households are a substantial contributor to outdoor air pollution. We found 9 bottom-up modeling studies that conducted global analysis of source attribution, and irrespective of the magnitude shown by the black bars here, all the studies find HAP to be a significant source of ambient air pollution globally. Taking a median of these estimates from the studies, we find that 20% of ambient air pollution globally comes from solid fuel use in households, which is 66% higher than contribution from industrial emissions, 80% higher than power generation, and 300% higher than emissions from transportation. A similar review over India found that about 26% of ambient air pollution comes from HAP. But if you look closely, there is a big spread between these studies, all the way from 12% to about 30 to 32%. Next slide, please. So what causes the spread between these bottom-up studies? First, I should confess that comparing estimates from these studies is very challenging, as each of these studies have unique model configurations and inputs, and the estimates present in each of the studies would likely vary if the input data were changed relative to the configuration used originally. However, it should be noted that we are not presenting such uncertainties to undermine the utility or value of these studies. Rather, we emphasize the relative consistency of estimates given the heterogeneity in emission inventories and model infrastructure. Now, the 2 major factors that may influence heterogeneity in contribution of HAP to AAP, or the spread between the studies that we saw in the last slide, are the bottom-up model infrastructure and the choice of emission inventories. So first, talking about model infrastructure, bottom-up models incorporate different physical and chemical processes necessary to predict time-varying PM2.5 concentrations. Careful choices should be made about horizontal and vertical resolutions, initial and boundary conditions for chemistry and aerosols if required, like in regional air pollution models, and nudging with meteorological variables. Now, global models generally tend to underestimate PM2.5 and other pollutant concentrations in the most polluted regions of the globe. Example, in East and South Asia and in Africa. These are also the regions where solid fuel use for household activities are very dominant. On the other hand, regional models are often better suited to local conditions. Alicia, can you please move to the previous slide? Yeah. Studies using regional models are expected to provide more fine-grained estimates of air pollutant exposure. Now, these regional models are capable of performing simulations at very fine resolution, but are computationally very intense and expensive, and therefore allow more resolved analysis. The global models, which are generally used to simulate at coarse horizontal resolutions, are typically incapable of identifying, pollution hotspots. Yeah, and similarly, use of different input data sets may play an important role towards what pollutant concentration and contribution of the sources are obtained. Next slide, please. Yeah, the second equally important factor that may cause this spread are differences in emission inventories. Now, building an emission inventory demands extensive efforts and may often take years. Potential uncertainties in emission factors, unexpected sources such as trash burning, inclusion of evolving emission standards, and knowledge of fuel types, among others, makes formulating an accurate emission inventory a daunting task. The selection of an emission inventory also plays a major role in determining how accurately models simulate ambient pollutant concentrations. Now, use of inventories which fail to incorporate fine details of activities, for example, type and amount of solid fuel burnt in households by region and activity, may result in considerable uncertainty. There is also significant heterogeneity among emission inventories on how the sources get categorized. Different emission inventories have distinct classification of sectors. For example, EDGAR, which is one of the widely used emission inventories, classify a household solid fuel use under the umbrella of residential and commercial sector, which include emissions originating both from households as well as from commercial activities. These emission database assume that such activities consume similar fuels and for similar purposes. However, this inclusion potentially adds about 5% more emission on top of those from households, more so in regions which where use of diesel generators are more prevalent and are considered a part of residential and commercial sector. For a specific region of interest, it is expected that emission inventories designed locally incorporate finer details than any global emission inventory. Next slide, please. Now, for studies which also attribute the contribution of HAP towards excess mortality associated with ambient air pollution, methodology for health impact assessment is an additional factor that may also contribute to the spread. Estimating excess deaths attributable to PM2.5 or air pollution requires 4 major inputs. These are estimates of distribution of population weighted exposures, specification of a level of exposure below which there is no increased risk of mortality, which is also known as the counterfactual concentration, estimates of the relative risk through the use of exposure response function that cover the range of globally experienced exposures, and fourth are estimates of baseline mortality rates. And use of distinct data for any of these may lead to widely different estimates of excess deaths. But among these, the most important are choice of exposure response functions. We found that just the use of a different exposure response function may result in about 100% change in health burden from contribution of HAP to ambient PM2.5. Next slide, please. And like we discussed, there are large regional heterogeneities in contribution of HAP to ambient air pollution, and bottom-up studies, they effectively capture those. The bars indicate the median percentage contributions of HAP to ambient PM2.5 in major regions globally. The large spread in the results are indicated by the error bars. The digits on the bars in black are the number of global studies, and in white are the number of regional studies that were included. We find that HAP is a dominant source of ambient fine particulate matter globally, regardless of course, variation in model types, what type of emission inventory was used, and model configurations. You also note large regional variabilities. For example, in South Asia, HAP contributes to about 27 to 30% of ambient PM2.5, while in high income North America, the contribution is much lower, something like 5%. So even in so if we even consider the lowest estimate of contribution of HAP to ambient air pollution, it indicates that household sources contribute a significant portion of the large premature mortality burden from ambient PM2.5 exposure. Regardless of model or method, there is relative consistency in the amount of mortality burden associated with HAP's contribution to ambient PM2.5, which is between 0.5 to 1 million deaths yearly. The latest GBD study estimated around 4 million deaths from exposure to ambient PM2.5, and taking the median estimate of 20% from the studies assessed here, at least 770,000 premature deaths may be averted if HAP is completely mitigated. And that on top of about 2.3 million deaths from direct exposure to HAP indoors. Next slide, please. And here are our recommendations. So first is accounting for missing emission sources and inter-emission inventory comparison studies. So many major sources dominant in LMICs like motorcycles, kerosene use, open waste burning, ad hoc oil refining, animal fodder preparation are missing from the global emission inventories. And this may result in big uncertainties in the results that I just presented. The uncertainty in emission inventories in data limited regions, which we believe can be improved by gathering more temporally and spatially defined data on primary and secondary fuel use, and energy end use activity data through the use of nationally represented surveys. And also use of new satellite-based products in data limited regions can be of help. Such activities will help to add nuance to our understanding of energy use at more high resolved spatial scales and contribute to more accurate emission inventories, in addition to enabling better tracking of progress of meeting energy related targets. We also suggest a detailed inter-emission inventory comparison study to understand the applicability of different emission inventories for different geographies, particularly in regions where there are no regional emission inventories. Yeah, next slide, please. So targeted investments in enhancing monitoring and emission data coupled with emission or refined bottom-up analysis have the potential to capture the benefits of interventions and to motivate sustained actions. In data and monitoring limited regions, we suggest targeted investments to enhance monitoring and top-down techniques which can inform and build indigenous emission data sets, and therefore helping to refine bottom-up source apportionment analysis. Yeah, next slide. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to reiterate that all the bottom-up modeling studies that conducted global analysis on of source attribution find HAP to be a significant source of ambient air pollution globally. Taking a median of the estimates, we find that about 20% of ambient air pollution globally comes from solid fuel use in the households, which is about 66% higher than contribution from industrial emissions and more than 300% higher than from transportation. Next slide. However, it should be known that HAP is a major emitter of organic aerosols, including black carbon and primary organic aerosols, and organic compounds which are precursors of secondary organic aerosols. And these components or these compounds may be much more hazardous to human health compared to secondary inorganic aerosols. So if HAP emissions are indeed more toxic per unit mass inhaled than PM2.5 emissions from other sources, the health effects of air pollution originating in solid fuel using households may be even greater than those estimated in the studies discussed here. For example, the ash bars here indicate contribution of sources considering all components in PM2.5 to be equally toxic. And the blue bars show the contributions considering black carbon primary organic aerosols and anthropogenic secondary organic aerosols to be twice as toxic. Under this assumption, household air pollution, which is indicated by DOM here, emerges as the largest source of PM2.5 related excess mortality globally from ambient air pollution. Its relative contribution amounts to about 32% compared to 20% under equal toxicity assumption. The excess mortality from biomass burning, which is indicated by BMB, and transportation indicated by TRA also increases, but these are minimal. However, it should be noted that these are assumptions. These are just assumptions, and the actual effects are largely unknown. Therefore, to strengthen health impact-based policies, we recommend studies that may enhance the understanding of the mechanisms, magnitude of increased risk to health posed by these organic aerosols, of which HAP is the largest source. And these are important for updating regulatory policies that aim at reducing disease burden of ambient PM2.5. Next slide. Coming to the last slide. So it's sad that 22 years into the 21st century, the most primitive source of air pollution still prevails. In spite of many policies implemented by national governments and global bodies, solid fuel remains by far the dominant fuel used for cooking in most LMICs of South Asia and Africa. While solid fuel, both biomass and coal are used for heating in most of East and Central Europe and Northern China. Around 50% of the people worldwide still lack access to clean fuel, and this group disproportionately suffers from multiple health effects from direct exposure to HAP and also indirectly from HAP's contribution to ambient air pollution. Now, all the studies we reviewed here, regardless of input data sets, methodologies, and the emission data sets, identify household solid fuel use as one of the leading contributors to ambient PM2.5 globally, contributing to about 20% of global PM2.5 exposure. We find that this fraction is responsible for about 770,000 premature deaths from exposure to ambient PM2.5, which is in addition to more than 2 million deaths from direct exposure to HAP. And therefore, cleaning up household combustion reduces exposure for those who cook within the households and can also substantially improve air quality for all. And it is important to remember that the total exposure in the end is what drives the health burden. And HAP is a large contributor to that exposure for both solid and clean fuel users. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Okay, so now we have about 25 minutes for questions, and I will be facilitating the Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can better look at the questions that folks are asking. Okay, so first question is, what are the most salient next steps in your opinion?
Okay, so yeah, so like I said, first of all, we need to have a good idea about what the uncertainties are in this estimation, and for that, we need to improve our modeling infrastructure as well as improving the emission inventories. And the next and the most important step is to eradicate solid fuel use in households, and that's what many countries are doing. And Ajay, would you like to add something here?
Yeah, I broadly agree there. I think the policy steps to eliminate solid fuel use are in the right direction. As we're moving along that pathway, I think, in line with the accountability studies that are happening here, it'd be really useful to have more robust monitoring in many of the places where we think this contribution is most substantial. And so having that in place would do a couple of things. It'd provide data to help strengthen these estimates and maybe drive down some of this uncertainty. And second, it would provide a basis for evaluating the effectiveness of these policies that are happening all over the world. And I know there's a lot of action on on that front to better monitor in many places around the globe. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, and then a next question we have is for household air pollution, were emissions from all household appliances, so for example, stoves, water heaters, furnaces, etc., measured?
Okay, so it depends on what emission inventory the studies are using. But for most emission inventories and most common ones like EDGAR, you have household emissions from cooking with solid fuels, as well as heaters and like water heating and space heating. But there are many sources or household sources that are missing. For example, animal fodder preparation. And there are many inventories which do not even take into consideration water heating and space heating into account. So it all depends upon what emission inventory are being used and how these emission inventories were built.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question is specifically for John. How does the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency view this information?
Thanks very much for that question. We're really excited to hear about it, largely because we're in the business of working with countries throughout the world to improve the quality of life. And so to do so, we need to know what is actually happening on the ground. And as a related issue, my colleagues at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, are working with countries around the world to develop monitoring systems so that countries can get a better understanding of what is actually happening in their country. Many U.S. embassies have monitoring systems, and sometimes they're the only monitoring system in a country, which, as we heard from Sourangsu, is not very robust. You need to have a monitoring system that is throughout the country, or at least throughout the cities, to get a better sense of what the pollution is at specific places. So we're really excited about this because this helps give us more information so we can do a better job of working with partners throughout the world to achieve their respective goals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then next question is, any estimates of the cost involved in implementing recommendations from this study?
Good. John, do you take that question?
I'm happy to take this question. Obviously, the costs are high, but as we know, the costs of doing nothing are higher. So this is just another reason why it's really important for countries from throughout the globe to move to introducing cleaner fuels and cleaner stoves throughout their country. For the multiple benefits that we started with, the premature deaths, the contribution to climate, the contribution to environmental degradation, the gender inequity issues. So action costs a lot, but it costs a lot less than where we are now.
Okay, thank you, John. And so the next question is, why do you think that there has been such a decrease in the use of solid fuels in South or Southeast Asian countries in recent years?
Well, so yeah, the answer is pretty straightforward, because in South Asian countries, particularly, over the last few years, starting in 2015, there have been multiple policies which were targeted towards reducing solid fuel use in households. That is by disseminating LPG to the poor, and the poor people were the ones that used solid fuel the most. So and I suppose the policies were largely successful, but how much successful, or the extent to which they were successful is yet to be analyzed. But there are data coming out soon to see how these policies were successful in reducing ambient air pollution or household air pollution in general.
Okay. And then next question we have is how, and then these are actually two questions. They're very closely related. So how difficult is doing source apportionment and how accurate are these efforts? And then relatedly, isn't source apportionment estimates only as accurate as good as the monitoring network?
Yeah, I mean, true. I mean, top-down are, you know, the observational source apportionment methodologies or the top-down methodologies are only as accurate as as the monitoring. So it takes a lot of effort to get them right. But the advantage of a top-down source apportionment is that it's observational and it's much it's against which you validate a bottom-up study. But the disadvantages of a top-down methodology are that you can only get information about the source apportionment at only a specific location. Does that answer?
Yep, I think so.
But yeah, and how difficult is it? It is doing source apportionment. I should say that it depends upon the expertise as well as the human resources. It can be very difficult in for certain places, and it can be very easy for certain places. So it all depends on on multiple levels and on multiple factors.
Okay, and the next question is, do you know what specifically contributes to the large spread in household air pollution's contribution to ambient air pollution for South Asia, 10 to 70%?
Yeah, so like I said, there are many factors which play big roles in how these information were obtained. For example, different emission inventories will give different estimates. And for example, you have an emission inventory which has just 4 sources, which has just 4 sectors, 4 source sectors. The contributions will be very different from an emission from using an emission inventory which is much more detailed and has multiple source sectors. So there are multiple factors that go into this, as well as the modeling infrastructure, how the emission inventories were built, and what source sectors were used or utilized. So yeah.
Okay, and then next question we've got is, do any of the models allow to identify specific solid fuels, a specific solid fuels contribution to particulate emissions?
So by specific solid fuels, if you mean like woods or coal or biomass,
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there are certain inventories or local inventories which allow those, but not most global inventories.
Okay, and then we also have a question about HAP to AAP, specifically in North America. Someone asked, you mentioned that HAP estimates to AAP in North America is around 7%. What do you think are the sources of this?
So I think the major sources of household air pollution in our contribution, our household air pollution in North America is burning of woods to heat up the households in the winter. So that is one of the major reasons. And EPA has been quite active and are implementing multiple policies to curb that.
Okay, and then next question is there a report or publication that is coming out of this work?
Yes, definitely. I mean, a report is on its way and a publication shortly thereafter.
Okay, and then will improvements in speciation make the top-down approach better? Seems as if bottom-up depends heavily on the emissions inventory, which would seem difficult to do well.
Well, so yes, improvement in speciation would make top-down approaches better. But like I said, the con of top-down approach is that you only get, idea about sources at a specific location. But the top-down approaches can be definitely used to inform emission inventory people to update emission inventories, and thereafter improving bottom-up estimates. So both of these can be used together to get better estimates or to reduce the uncertainties per se.
Okay, and then the next question seems like kind of a tough one to answer, but a good one. According to your findings, what is the ideal depollution path? And I know you talked about this a little bit in your recommendations, but maybe you can just expand a bit more.
So the ideal depollution path. Okay, so what I'd say is that we are going in the right directions towards at least depolluting houses. There are many policies that are implemented currently in the developing world that are targeting household air pollution, and but the effectiveness of these policies towards reducing ambient air pollution, like I said, is still to be checked, and still to be seen if it's towards depollution or not.
Chime in quickly. Yeah, I of course I agree with that, and I think the other one other aspect is, of course, we can do these policies to reduce household air pollution and continue working on all the other things that people are concerned with as well, whether that's transit or power or industry. And you've seen a lot of commentary around this work in particular in India that we can what's the statement, walk and chew gum at the same time, so work on across multiple sectors. And I think that approach is important. Part of the impetus for this work is to draw attention to this rather under recognized contribution to ambient air pollution.
Yeah, and just to jump in also, Alicia, as we start to focus on so many issues that nest within each other, for example, on climate, we see that more action is going to be taken by country governments, where historically, leadership has been from international NGOs or partners within a country, but not so much from country governments. This is an opportunity for country governments to become more involved. And as they do, as we have seen in places where country governments have become involved, there's a lot more impact and a lot cleaner fuels being rapidly used. So there's a hope that with all these things nesting together, we can move forward more rapidly and, as they say, depollute.
Okay, we have just about 5 minutes left, so just a few, hopefully we can squeeze in just a couple more questions. So next one is, if a transition were to be made entirely from solid fuel to propane, for example, might we start to see effects of types of cooking on household air pollution, for example, emissions from frying of food versus cooking food in a pot?
Yeah, I think we certainly would expect the emissions profiles to change. From our perspective, at least so far, the magnitude of emissions from solid fuel use kind of outweighs frying. And so as we're thinking about taking a risk assessment approach, we would start by reducing the emissions from solid fuels and then think about knocking down emissions from cleaner cooking sources as we move through. Certainly true that cooking is a large source of emissions, whether you're in the developing world or the developed world. Yeah, good question.
Okay, and then
actually, hold on a second, Alicia. I just wanted to jump in on that.
Yep.
Recently, it's become increasingly apparent what some of the emissions are in the developed world. And one of the things that my colleagues at EPA and the Indoor Environments Division are continuously promoting is ventilation. A lot of people have hoods above their stoves that they just never turn on. And the reality is you should be turning it on every time you use your stove. So we have a lot of education to do throughout the world on cooking.
Okay, and then we've got a question asking, is there any research which can be used to promote the least polluting fuels to be used in the best appliances that are properly installed and maintained? So that could assist people and governments to choose the right fuels and appliances well installed and maintained. So for example, in the United Kingdom, many people are turning to wood because of the increasing cost of gas. Could anything be used to clean emissions before release without causing problems such as carbon monoxide in homes?
Ajay,
I can take a stab, and then John, maybe you can chime in a little bit. Yeah, certainly you can do things to burn wood more efficiently in your home, including making sure your flue is working and you have sort of good ventilation, as John mentioned. I don't think it's probably practical to think about scrubbing household emissions from wood fireplaces, though. John, you might have a better sense of where the fireplace and the wood burning stove.
Yeah, so
situation is.
As Sourangsu had mentioned, there is still significant air pollution coming in, say, from North America from wood burning to heat homes. And so as this expands, and it is expanding actually in the northern parts of the planet, it's really important to work with the fuel in advance. So EPA has this program we call BurnWise, and it's all about making sure that you're using wood that is dry and that you store the wood, particularly so it does dry out and does not reabsorb moisture. And doing things like this that you can control, as well as Ajay had mentioned, making sure your flue is clean. But if the wood is dry, it'll burn more completely and you'll be emitting less. So there are things that can be done without scrubbing. And frankly, I don't and have never heard of scrubbing individual smokestacks or individual chimneys from homes.
Thank you. And then do any inventories currently include consideration of secondary organic aerosol formation?
Yes. So the inventories, they generally have VOCs. And the VOCs, they are fed into the model as a part of the emission inventory, and then they lead to the formation of secondary organic aerosols as outputs from the model. So the inventories have VOCs, and certain inventories have lumped VOCs, for example, VOC as a whole, and certain inventories have speciated VOCs, like for example, propane, ethane, and so on. Yeah.
And the next question, what kind of stovetop changes have you had to implement in Southeast Asia with the change to LPG? How much guidance did they get from the local population when proposing and making these changes, and how are people responding?
I can start to perhaps answer this one. It's perhaps a difficult question, and the answer may be too long. But let's see. So as part of the Indian government program to promote LPG or make it more accessible and affordable, they provided a relatively inexpensive 2-burner stove. And there was some guidance about placement of the stove. And indeed, when people first got connected to the LPG system, which is what it's called when you hook up with LPG in India, there's a distributor that comes to your house and installs your cylinder and your stove and provides you some training and some guidance on how to use it. How well that worked is an open question. And then in subsequent parts of the program, the Indian government implemented what they called LPG Panchayat, which was these community level meetings about how to use the stove and what are some of the challenges, how you cook things with it. And so there was a fair amount of attempts at behavior change communication with the intervention, but there's likely a lot more to say there and look into.
Okay, awesome. So I think we've got time for one last question. So this one is, in the United States, it appears most urban centers look at tackling particulate matter emissions by working on strategies of addressing emissions from industry and transportation. Do you think the environmental agencies, such as local and state agencies, are missing an opportunity to reduce particulate matter emission if they put more effort in addressing household air emissions?
That's a interesting question. And I think it gets to what Sourangsu was talking about, is emission inventories. I think it's just so important that everywhere in the world, because it's different everywhere in the world, we have a really good sense of where the pollution is coming from. And then we address that pollution as we see it. So in those parts of North America or in the United States where we have air pollution that's coming from home heating, we should be addressing that. And I know EPA, working with states and local communities, is working to get more improved stoves in people's homes. We have regulations on new stoves, new heating stoves, and they're very efficient. Unfortunately, they cost money. So it's the same issue as it is around the world. To trying to get people to a more efficient appliance, there's the barrier of cost. However, it's as we learn more about what the emissions are, this becomes more important to work with communities and individual homeowners to get these improved stoves in people's homes to achieve our respective environmental and health goals.
So I think that's all the time for the Q&A. I think there were just a few questions that we didn't answer, and we will answer those offline. And then, of course, if you have additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to us about this work at any point in time. And I'll pass it off to Donnie for closing remarks now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sourangsu, Ajay, and John. Really, I think informative and such a complicated topic that you really brought to the audience in a very clear way. And really, it just goes to show that it continues to be a very important issue. Household air pollution continues to be something that is underfunded and under-researched, especially when it comes to ambient air pollution. And so this was, I think, a step in the right direction and will help, I know, CCA and I think EPA as well, think about next steps on where we want to head with this. But again, I just really appreciated the presentations today and all of the really great questions from the audience. So thanks again. And we will be certain to get back to you on those questions that we weren't able to answer within the time limit today. So thanks again for joining the webinar, and thanks to Sourangsu and Ajay one last time.